Hello and welcome to the Essex Boys Murder videos. These videos are based on key individuals and the murder victims' movements on the day of the 6th of December 1995. A quick mention to my Facebook page called The Real Essex Boys Murder Group. If you're interested, please feel free to join, as there's some great people on there with a lot of knowledge on this subject. So this is part 6 of a set of videos looking at a robbery that took place in 1989, a link to Anthony Tucker, known underworld figures, and a look into the possibility to see if Mick, Jack and Darren Nichols knew what was going to happen to the Essex Boys that night and who could have made that phone call to Pat Tates' mobile at 5:03 p.m. It is not known if this call was made on the 5th, the day before the murders, or the 6th, the evening of the murders. If you haven't seen part 1 to 5 yet, I do recommend watching them first, as I covered how the 1989 robbery came about and I've gone into a lot of detail about it. Then I covered how one of the masterminds, Hollywood's nightclub doorman David Corson, recruited other doormen for the heist with the help of Anthony Tucker. I then went through how the robbery was planned with the help of the other mastermind, John Aitken, who was their inside man. I also covered the day of the robbery and the route the gang took, not forgetting key places that were used to pull it off. I covered the statements that the two security guards gave, one being the inside man, John Aitken. Last of all, I covered what the gang did afterwards and what the getaway driver, Roger Barkley, who used his own vehicle for the robbery, did with it after the heist. That information has never been put out anywhere before. I have been given exclusive access into this robbery and what happened after by a trusted source. Before I start, I'm going to tell you that there's been a lot of false information put out in the tabloids and on social media linking armed robber Billy Jasper and the Group 4 security van robbery to Anthony Tucker. It has been said high echelon crime figure Patsy Bowties Clark was the mastermind behind the robbery and gave £300,000 of the cash from the heist to Anthony Tucker to launder for them through a supposed pub in South Ockenden and his security business. It was then said Patsy Clark and the gang wanted their money back, and Anthony Tucker told them it had all gone and refused to pay it back, and this was the reason for a contract taken out on him. This information is untrue and totally inaccurate. There's also been other false information put out on social media and in the tabloids involving this robbery and what happened afterwards. Through my trusted source, you will get an accurate account of what really happened. As I go through these sets of videos, I will dispel those myths that have been put about and give you accurate information that has been given to me with a lot of research I have done myself. Trust me, viewers, when I tell you this, you will not see a more accurate account of how that 1989 security van robbery was planned, pulled off, and what happened afterwards anywhere else. Not on any other YouTube channel, social media site, or what's printed in the tabloids. So let's start with part 6. As I said in a previous video, the gang that took part in the actual robbery would not have any contact with the co-mastermind and inside man John Aitken or the other co-mastermind David Corson for months after the robbery, which took place in October 1989. Now this would be quite easy, as John Aitken had only met the 3 robbers, David Redwin, Roger Barkley and Mr. T, on one occasion besides the actual robbery, which was in a room at the Hollywood's nightclub in Romford to discuss the robbery. As I've explained in previous videos, the reason I've decided to keep Mr. T's name anonymous is because he was interviewed by New Scotland Yard's Flying Squad detectives months after the robbery, but was released without charge. Unbeknown to them, Mr. T played a pivotal role in the robbery, which I covered in a previous video. John Aitken lived close to the Group 4 security company that he worked for in Witham, Essex, and he was many miles away from the others. He knew the co-mastermind David Carston the most, as they worked together on van runs for the Group 4 security company in the past. David Carston was living right up in the Ipswich area and was also many miles away from the others. He carried on working the doors at the Hollywoods in Ipswich. David Redwin and Roger Barclay carried on working the doors at the Hollywoods in Romford, so there was little chance they would be seen together. Mr. T was drafted into the robbery by Anthony Tucker on behalf of David Carston. He was more into criminality with East End villains. Now, they lived in the Dagenham and Ilford areas of London. The gang also agreed that after the robbery, any contact with messages would go through a middleman. Someone who played a minor role in the robbery by recruiting members on behalf of David Carston. Anthony Tucker. Anthony Tucker lived in the Boreham area of Chelmsford at the time and agreed to be the middleman for them. Roger Barclay, who used his own vehicle for the robbery, a red Ford Escort van, scrapped it but never gave the logbook to the scrapyard owners, nor did he fill it in and send it off himself. He just drove into the scrapyard and left it with the keys inside. Now, scrap dealers aren't too fussy about this, as they still get money for the metal when they weigh it in. It's quite obvious the owner doesn't want the car anymore and it's been left there, and it's more than likely the owner of the vehicles that leave cars at scrapyards fill in the log form and send it off themselves. You may be thinking why owners of vehicles they longer won't do this. Most scrapyards usually charge people to scrap their vehicles. Some do offer money. It just depends on the value of the vehicle. If it's about, say, 10 or 12 years old, the scrappers can strip the vehicles of the parts and sell them on, then crush the shell and weigh it off. If it's a much older vehicle, say 15 or 20 years old, they can't strip them for the parts, as they are harder to sell, as most of the vehicles will be out of circulation. Now, Roger Barclay certainly didn't want to be seen driving his own vehicle after the robbery. He didn't want to be seen by anyone who worked at the scrapyard. He didn't want any receipts or links to his vehicle after the robbery. If the police link him to the robbery and contact local scrapyards for any details of vehicles that have been scrapped after the robbery, his name could have been on a receipt, or one of the workers at the scrapyard could have noticed him, so it made more sense for him to just drive into the yard, leave the keys inside, and walk off, and then go home and report to the police that his vehicle had been stolen. When the local police came to make a statement about his stolen vehicle, he would just simply say he worked nights as a doorman and was sleeping through the day, so never noticed it missing until evening time when he was due to set off to work in Romford. With a crime reference number, he could also claim money off his insurance company. He also knew local police didn't have the resources to go around looking around scrapyards, and they would just simply put it on their system to look out for a stolen red Ford Escort van, most probably in the area of London where he was from. New Scotland Yard's Flying Squad investigation team were investigating the 1989 Group 4 security robbery. The lead investigating officer in the case would have sent his team of officers to take out statements from John Aitken, who was the van driver at the time of the robbery, and unbeknown to them, the inside man. They would have also taken one from the unsuspected guard, Anthony Flint, who was threatened with a handgun and forced into the security van and later hit numerous times and tied to a tree. All the Group 4 employees are victims of the armed robbery. The lead investigating officer and his team would have classed them as potential suspects of being inside men in the heist. Background checks would have been done on both of them. The lead investigating officer would have put a watch on both of them at some point of the investigation, which would have been done quite early on. Both men would have been followed by his officers, looking at who they met up with and where they went, watching out for irregular spending patterns like new cars or luxury holidays, or even money spent on their properties. Anything that could link them to the stolen £495,000 that belonged to the TSB. I know there will be people out there who won't believe what I have just said. That's fine, but this is common practice with the police, especially the New Scotland Yard's flying squad. They definitely would have put a surveillance team on John Aitken and Anthony Flint and watched them around the clock. This wouldn't have been for long, as there was nothing out of the ordinary happening from the two Group 4 employees. Anthony Flint would have carried on as normal, as he knew nothing about the robbery and was just an innocent guard. John Aitken can't spend any of his money, as it's all been kept at a secret location by the three gang members. The money will be shared out months later as planned, and the lead investigating officer would have pulled in the surveillance on him too, as nothing out of the ordinary was happening and he wasn't meeting up with any criminals capable of pulling off an armed robbery. The lead investigating officer would be well aware of putting officers on surveillance would eat into his budget. If they did do any surveillance on John Aitken or Anthony Flint, it was a waste of time. What I do know is that the prosecution never put forward any evidence at the trial for any surveillance carried out by the lead investigating officer and his team of detectives. None was passed to the defence. It would have been useless anyway if they did, because nothing out of the ordinary happened. The lead investigating officer would have told his team of detectives to ask for any witnesses who saw the robbery in progress to come forward with any information, no matter how little. Local newspapers and journalists would have been drip-fed information to help them with their inquiries. Now, there's a myth out there that the police and journalists hate each other, but it's simply not true. They actually work closely with each other, passing on information to one another. Now, this benefits both parties. They both feed off each other. Look at well-known criminal cases that have been covered by the media over the years. TV shows and documentaries that have been made. The police and the tabloids work hand in hand, passing information on to one another. What the police do is hold back certain information for the purposes of, if they do arrest and interview criminals, it hasn't been put out in the media and it can be used as evidence at the trial, as it has never been put in the public domain. That is exactly how it works between the police and the media. What I do find strange with New Scotland Yard's flying squad detectives is when the cashier from the petrol station came forward with the registration number of a red Ford Escort van acting suspicious on the forecourt just half an hour before the robbery and was just less than a quarter of a mile away from where it took place, never made the link and acted on this information. They never interviewed the owner of that van, who was Roger Barclay. The Group 4 security guard, Anthony Flint, would have put it in his statement that as he came out of the newsagents, he saw two men get out of a red Ford Escort van and come towards him, threaten him with a handgun, and then force him into the security van. The inside man and van driver, John Aitken, would have covered himself by saying 2 men got out of a red Ford Escort van and went towards. His colleague then dragged him into the van and hijacked it. How did these New Scotland Yard's top flying squad officers never make the connection and arrest Roger Barclay with this information? A newspaper covered the story on the robbery, and in that article it said, and I quote, "A red Ford Escort van was driven by a third member of the gang. The cash was transferred to the van. Registration number A233SLF. How did they not question Roger Barclay, as it was his van? The gang wasn't arrested until 7 months later. How did these supposed top detectives working for New Scotland Yard's flying squad never make this connection? I find it shocking. So with the flying squad detectives struggling to find out who the robbers were, and with no fresh leads of inquiry, they had drawn a blank and the case went cold for them. So that's it for this particular video. Don't forget, you can join my Facebook page, The Real Essex Boys Murder Group. So until next time, take care.